The survivors of the morning session, so congratulate you on that, and thank you for staying with us. This is just the concluding part of it, and I wanted to just offer an opportunity for members of the panel, for both panels, to reflect on anything that they might want to add to the conversation left over from this morning. And of course, there's a lot of interest on the economic parts of the puzzle, on the what is the future of the universities in consideration of all these issues that are ongoing, and maybe some advice that they might want to give to the University of Guam. I mean, so feel free to give advice, good advice, of course, and we'll take other forms of advice as well. But before I do that, I just wanted to again acknowledge the planning committee, Dr. Ann Hattori, and there's Dr. Ann, Dr. Nicholas Getschritt, where's Nick? Right there. Dr. Kirk Johnson, who went off island over the weekend, Dr. Ross Miller, David Okada, where's David? There he is in the back. Dr. Clarette Ruane, who is in class right now. Dr. John Sanchez. And of course, Ms. Louise Tovis, who is on one of her 50 errands for the day. So we want to thank her for that as well. I just want to first of all express my gratitude to the members of the panel for coming to Guam, especially for Mary. It was such a hardship for her to come all the way to Tamuning. Because, Mary has the, she lives right next to both GCC and UOG. I mean, so her commute's pretty short. But no, just to express my gratitude to all concerned. And we'll start off, we can go anywhere. I don't know which way we'll start, but why don't we start with Ricardo, since you led off the conversation about the challenges that we're faced with. Since most of the trends that you've identified, many of the trends that you identified are kind of like from a U.S. Framework, and yet we're seeing that, the framework is changing. So, maybe you have some thoughts on that or some ideas or reflections.
Well, thank you. As I was listening to the conversation and the exchange of ideas, I was thinking of how one of the big changes that I've noticed since, for example, I reflect on when I went to college many years ago. And my original notion was to become a physician. So I was taking a pre-med curriculum with all the science courses and so on. And then I decided not really to do that. I ended up getting a major in philosophy, because I had to take a number of philosophy courses, and I was interested in that. And I got a minor in chemistry. So I had no clue of workforce. I mean, my insertion into the workforce, and I didn't sort of have to worry about that because there weren't that many people who had graduated, not many people attending, and not many people graduating. If you graduated from a university, your chances were that you were going to get a position somewhere, maybe not the best paying position, but it was a very open market. That, I think, has changed significantly. And a lot of students are now very much focused on the workforce. In other words, if I'm going to invest my time and effort, what's going to give me the best opportunity to find a position, not just any position, but a position that is going to allow me to, in the United States, as a role to the middle class. That's what my students in the Bronx come to me and say, what can I study? And they want to focus on a particular field. And I sometimes tell them, well, yes, you need skills in one particular field, but think of it, most of the jobs that are good paying jobs now weren't even invented 15 years ago. They were not around. So if you train for a specific thing, chances are that's going to change significantly. So what does that mean in terms of your own education? Critical thinking and how to read and write and analyze and understand quantitative literacy so that we don't end up accepting as gospel truth a lot of the nonsense that we find in the media and on the internet. So the internet is a double-edged sword. It provides us with a huge amount of information. That's the good news. And that's the bad news. It's the same thing. Because the more information that is put out there, the more difficult it becomes to sort through that and really extract from that things that are useful. So I see universities increasingly being pushed by policymakers into connecting in a more direct way, a more visible way, with workforce development. But my hope is, and this is my struggle in trying to educate policymakers and legislators, not to make that so rigid that they insist on a particular field or a particular short-term benefit. To think of, the concept of lifelong learning was mentioned as part of social justice. And most of what we are going to need in our lifetimes, we can't learn in 4 years or in 6 years. So we have to keep on learning constantly. The internet is wonderful to help us with that, but it's not a panacea, and it's not going to help us. But if we have some of those skills embedded in our curriculum, I think our students are better equipped to face whatever the future presents to them. The last point I want to make in terms of policymakers and legislators, one of the things that is most frustrating to me is when I talk to elected officials, and I realize higher education and the way it's changed is rather complex, but they want simple solutions to problems that are rather complex. H.L. Mencken, the famous pundit and writer, said one time or wrote sometime that every problem has a simple solution, and it's usually wrong. So I have to keep on talking to my elected officials and policymakers and try to get them to devote a little bit more time and effort to understanding some of the complexity. But let me give you a specific example. In the City University of New York, the history of the City University goes back more than 150 years, when City College was founded in 1847 to educate the children of the people. Now, the problem with the people was that was only for boys and men. So Hunter College had to be created to address women and to bring them into higher education. And then there was growth in the system, and the system kept on growing, but it was free. Free. The people paid up to 1975 some very minor fees to go through 4 years of schooling. It was a great deal, but it was unsustainable. And in 1975, when President Ford told New York City, drop dead, that was the headline in one of the local papers, because they wanted a bailout. The state legislature then took over the senior colleges and began to make contributions to fund the City University of New York. So now the senior colleges are funded by the state, and the community colleges are funded half by the state and half by the city. So it's a very complex evolution, and I think every system has its own peculiarities. So some of what I have to say may apply, and most of it maybe doesn't apply. But because we have to look at it locally. But when I talk to them, some of them went when it was free. So when we talked about tuition, they said, as a matter of principle, I am opposed to tuition increases. I said, okay. what are the consequences of your position when energy costs are going up, when we have contracts with the faculty and the staff that require increases every so many steps, and when we have other expenses of equipment and all the unfunded mandates that you impose on us, those are consequences. So we either serve fewer students or we have to cut somewhere. And I said, we're not campaigning right now, so get off your soapbox and let's have a real conversation about what's reality here. It's taken us something like 10 years to really arrive at some understanding, I think, and acceptance on the part of the governor and on the part of some of the legislature to allow some sort of rational way of increasing tuition tied to certain economies and efficiencies and building tuition increases on a modest, graduate, predictable basis, so that rather than have the system we had before, where there was no tuition increase for many, many years, and if you were a student that started and went through that hiatus, you lucked out. But at some point, tuition would go up $500 or $750. And then it wouldn't go up for a number of years, and the state would keep giving a little bit more money and more. So when I showed them a chart with all these increases over the last 20 years, and I said, Senator, the issue is not whether tuition is going to go up. It's going to go up. The question is when and how much. So wouldn't it be better to have some sort of slope, more gradual, modest, so that people can actually do some planning and anticipate some of this? And assuming the state is not going to be able to afford this, there has to be some sort of compact that enables the support of higher education. We're still debating that, but I think generally they have a better understanding and a much wider acceptance of the notion that this is something that involves an investment on the part of the individual, because it's now considered, higher education is now viewed as a private benefit rather than a public good. Back in the 60s, when governments were investing hand over fist in higher education, building campuses all over, university systems, that era is gone. So now education, since people benefit as individuals, is seen as a private benefit. So, hey, it's like buying a car. And you have to pay for it. And you have to pay a lot of money for that. So those are some of the issues, and those are some of the thoughts that came to my mind as I pondered some of the comments of my colleagues.
Well, the same issues somehow also affect developing countries. I can only speak in the context of the developing countries in Southeast Asia. The notion that universities are supposed to produce graduates who can match up with the job requirements of the market. But more and more, as we have already stated very clearly, with globalization, knowledge-driven world, information changes very fast. By the time a student graduates, what he has learned in terms of information might already be obsolete. So it's important that we develop the skills, critical thinking, problem solving, etc. And that's becoming evident in our part of the world. Some Asian universities or Southeast Asian universities have focused mainly on specialist training. They train engineers, they train scientists, without getting their students to go through liberal arts education or general education. Whereas my university, having had the American tradition, of liberal arts education, we have the first 2 years as general education. So that's the norm, and we're maintaining that because we believe that through general education, we're able to develop these skills among our students for lifelong learning, critical thinking, etc., etc. And I noticed that the universities in our neighboring countries, particularly Singapore, for example, is moving towards the direction we're already in. You know, they want to give their students more general education type preparation. You know, and might even increase the length of the length of time they keep their students in the university. They recently created a liberal arts college, you know, because they're finding out that technical training or training focused too much on specialization might not do the trick in terms of producing future leaders. You know. Leaders will be able to manage in, you know, situation of uncertainty, ambiguity, or complexity. And so we're maintaining that tact, and I don't know about, you know, this notion that, well, of course, in the U.S., education is seen as private good now, you know. But in many developing countries, it's still, you know, very much public good, you know, because of the dearth in the supply of leaders. It used to be that the development agencies were supporting only basic education in the developing world, you know. Now the shift has been more in favor of higher education because there's this thinking, you know, that unless we're able to fix higher education, it's hard to fix basic education because the direction has to be clear, you know. What are we preparing our students for, you know, in terms of what they get in higher education? Plus, the notion that we can produce a lot of skills at the basic level, but we need managers, we need leaders, you know, who will harness the resources of a given country. So that's still the notion, you know, that it's okay, private good for many, but it's still pretty much public good, serving the general interest of society. Now, in a public university like University of the Philippines, tuition is a big issue because, as you say, you know, when I was a student, practically paid nothing, you know, for my college education. Now, students are paying much more by the standards of the country, and we went through that 300% increase, you know, 5 years ago, and that created a lot of trouble. But that was also the time when socialized tuition fee structure was introduced in order to soften the impact. Okay, but I could see the merit, you know, of a gradual increase. In fact, when the 300% increase in tuition fee was introduced, there was a provision that there will be a yearly increase based on inflation rate, you know, to avoid a future situation when we need to do a quantum increase in tuition fee. Well, but since inflation rate has been very low, about 3 to 4%, during the past couple of years, or since the time, you know, the rule was introduced, you know, to adjust according to inflation, there has really been no increase made, you know. There has been, I would say, lack of political will, you know, to do it because of strong resistance, you know, from the student body. So it requires some political will as well on the part of the administration. Now, the other contentious issue in a country like the Philippines and in other developing countries is this notion of creating world-class universities. Well, of course, in the U.S., that's a non-issue, you know. I mean, the top universities in the world are all U.S. Universities. But in developing countries, that's becoming to be the challenge. You know? Creating world-class university to be able to place the country at some equal footing, you know, with the developed world in an era of globalization, you know, because with globalization, it's supposed to be open competition. And if we believe in the notion, and I think it's a fact, you know, that universities are, you know, the engine of knowledge creation, knowledge transmission in a society. And in a knowledge-driven world, it's very important that you have world-class universities that are research-intensive, universities that will not just be educating or giving instruction to students, but will be engaged much more in creating new knowledge and transmitting new knowledge. And that requires certain degree of research intensity. And the quest, the quest for having this world-class university is a demanding one, given that it requires significant amount of resources. And the question is, should it be just one university, two universities? And if it's one, which one? Of course, in the Philippines, there are in the Philippines now 110 state-owned universities. Well, of course, the University of the Philippines, by far, as the national university, is the premier university. So we sort of assumed, that it will be our university, although the government has not yet made the pronouncement. We'll see in the budget deliberations for 2013, which will start after the State of the Nation address this coming July, whether we will be it. But other countries have already poured a lot of money in their chosen national universities so that they could begin developing as world-class universities like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, of course, and Indonesia. So somehow we face the same challenges, but we sometimes differ in some of the viewpoints and solutions.
Following up on the world-class university idea, it's interesting to look at what's happening now, particularly in the United States and in Europe, to the universities that have been and would be considered world-class. So Harvard, to start. Harvard originally was funded based on the toll that was charged to go from Boston to Cambridge across the river. Harvard was originally funded with public money, and it's, I suppose, the least public university there is now. The University of California system is beginning a transition now because of the economic crisis in California to start moving towards private status. And I think the question about whether prestigious, high-intensity research universities will become private, I think is an area for concern, because it means they're controlled by the people who invest in them rather than controlled on a public side. So the far end of the evolution of research universities, I think, is an area where we should be concerned. But the public interest that universities serve, I think, is really well captured by the land grant concept in the United States. And I think it is appropriate that this is the 150th anniversary of that concept, but it's based on the assumption that you can structure a university for the public good to justify the public's investment. And if there's doubt about whether we're doing a good job of that, it's kind of our responsibility to correct that. What is the return that the state receives on its investment in our universities? And in my discussions with legislators, the answer is not so much, I think, in terms of numbers of degrees granted or numbers of majors offered or anything like that. I think it goes much deeper in terms of creating economic capacity in a state, creating new opportunities that simply wouldn't have been present. What would happen to Guam if the University of Guam tomorrow tripled its tuition and became a private school? I think part of how we explain the benefit, the public benefit of the university, lies in how we would answer that question.
I want to actually raise a question to all of us that may have some bearing on University of Guam. This has to do with the free education, MOOC, the move towards that. There are two parts to it. One is the content. The content is the professors or the intellectuals. The other is the medium through which the content is disseminated. Now, do you think that over the next few years, decades, the medium will be thoroughly controlled by corporations? So even if the professor wanted to have his content freely available, it's a medium which will be the constraining factor. And for us, I mean, those of us who are in the process of getting online education in various areas, it will be an important matter, particularly when the satellites are controlled by certain national powers. I mean, what will be the outcome?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because we're, the existing models that we have, as many people have pointed out, that this model doesn't work anymore. So the way we conduct our education, the way we fund our education, is just fundamentally shifted. And sometimes the last people to wake up to that are people who work at universities, because they think, hey, everything's great, it's just moving along. Can we just continue to have the same system over and over and over? And it's not a workable model. But the content and the form in which it's communicated, I think some of the more fascinating things for me in this conversation is the discussion of globalization and regionalization, and then the certification process. Because then if what Ray keeps talking about over there is that engineers are now going to be able to get certificated as engineers and go anywhere they want within the ASEAN countries and eventually in APEC countries, well, what does that mean? Who then starts to continue to manage that process? So here we are. Originally, I'll confess that I invited USP to come, and they turned down, so we invited you. But the question for USP, that is, right now, we're always quick to say that the University of Guam is the only U.S. accredited institution on this side of the date line, as this positions us in a kind of a competitive and framework. Well, after a while, maybe U.S. accreditation will mean nothing. Or, as USP is trying to get accredited by WASC, which accredits also the University of Guam and GCC and. So now what does WASC mean after that? And there's an application from an English-speaking college in Baja California that's trying to get accredited by WASC. So now this whole thing, the whole paradigm starts to shift. And I'm just wondering to what extent are we ready for that? And whether we will now turn inward, and at the same time that we have the pressures of trying to be of service to our community and trying to find the right trajectory of forces to make that. It's a daunting thing to think about, because in many ways the universities in the developing countries will be the ones that are on the cutting edge of this, because they will be the ones with the flexibility to deal with this. Trying to figure out where the U.S. Higher ed fits into this is a little bit more difficult, because first of all, we see ourselves as part of the we're part of the elite group, we're the elite line. Everybody wants to be like us in some way. And then when we find out 10 years down the line, nobody wants to be like us anymore. I don't know what we do. Is it clear to you what we do then, Ricardo? Maybe, yeah.
Well, I wouldn't presume to advise, but I think, President Obama has said that there'll be a shift of emphasis from Europe to the Pacific. I don't know whether he means it to be in terms only of military presence or what, but if it means that it's a recognition that a lot of economic developments will be in the Pacific in the coming years, then I think, yeah, it might be worthwhile to look from your point of view westward. Is it westward? And there are natural agrupations. I was part of the Association for Engineering Education in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we had members, not only from ASEAN, but the Pacific as well. And there are a lot of discussions and papers being delivered during the triennial conferences of this organization. So I think, in general, it might be a good idea to get engaged in this part of the world. That is certainly what we're trying to do as well, to be very much engaged with what is happening in East Asia and the Southeast Asian region and the Pacific region. Certainly, the Philippines has had problems in terms of economic development, and that one we have to grapple with. But the only, I think, viable strategy would be to get engaged in what is happening in the region. Otherwise, we risk the danger of getting left farther behind. There are a lot of mechanisms by which we're able to do this, and we join associations of schools as well as of professions. No? I was in Sydney about 2 weeks ago for a meeting of the International Engineering Alliance. It's really very interesting how these things move. The Washington Accord was established in 1989, and the member countries were the US, the leading light, UK, Ireland, South Africa, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, and most of the Commonwealth countries. But since that time, or it has since expanded very rapidly, especially in the last 10 years. So Japan came in, Taiwan came in, Malaysia, Singapore, Russia is trying to get in. Even Germany was trying to get in at some point. And, Hong Kong has always been an original member. But more and more countries are trying to get into the Washington Accord. And there's a biennial meeting, and there's a governing body that oversees. Actually, not just the Washington Accord, but 3 accords. Washington Accord for professional engineers, the Sydney Accord for engineering technologies, and the Dublin Accord for engineering technicians. And it also manages 3 registers of engineers: the APEC Engineers Register, the International Professional Engineers Register, and the Register for Engineering Technologies. So the meeting is for 1 week, and we break up. Wherever you're a member, you join the meeting. And the process is slow, but on the other hand, I think it's really inexorable. It moves. Every year something happens. Even definition of graduate attributes will have to be cleared by the entire body, and that is how we're able to decide on standards. So for us, I think it's imperative that we're engaged in these types of organizations. I think that for us is the globalization very, very concretely expressed. And while we have a lot of problems trying to come up to standards, I don't think we have a choice but to go with the flow in this sense. Turkey has become a member, and so on the strength of a lot of its programs being accredited by ABET. So it actually breezed through membership in Washington Accord because a lot of its programs have been ABET accredited for some time. I think that's my only thought here right now, that there should be more engagement with this part of the world. And of course, there are big countries there like China, and but that have to be also appreciated in the light of regional happenings. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you.
So as I listened this morning to a lot of the presentations, or all of the presentations, one of the things that I thought about was, what impacts do these institutions have in higher education for our region? And then as a PPEC membership, how can PPEC, or what can PPEC do to support our region? Several months ago at the University of Guam commencement address, Secretary LaHood said, it's all about relationships. And so now we're all here. We've had a chance to meet one another. We've had a chance to engage with many of the faculty members and members of the community of Guam. And so we've now begun the process of building a relationship. And that relationship is going to take us a lot further than we think. Primarily because one day, someone's going to figure out how are we going to bring the interconnectivity of our islands so that all of our islands have internet capabilities at the speed that we all enjoy. And that'll encourage us to engage more in knowledge sharing, discussion, and upward mobility. It's also going to give opportunities for our local residents to engage in leadership positions. It's going to give us an opportunity to train these folks. And what does that do? It's going to encourage economic development in our islands so that we can sustain ourselves. But then how do we continue on workforce development? And that partnership has to be with engaging with the business community or the local government to identify what is their strategic plan for growing their economies. And then how can we identify what those occupational areas are that are needed? What kind of partnerships do we need to develop? Or cohorts of students that are going to be necessary to fill these jobs. And so across the region, particularly with UOG and UH Hilo, UH Manoa, they've taken aggressive steps towards greater articulation agreements between the colleges and these institutions. And where PPEC members can continue to benefit is in the area of professional development and expertise, additional research, and knowledge sharing. And then, of course, succession planning, so that as members of our institution go on, that there's someone that can carry out these activities and continue to engage in these partnerships. And so those are just my thoughts. PPEC has a lot to benefit from this forum, and I believe that there's a great commitment for continued collaboration and investment in our educational systems.
Though I'm intrigued by the discussion that has been going on, focusing on globalization and the role of universities, and I see that as being very critical, I'd like to shift the conversation for a moment, because when I reflect on the panel, both panel discussions this morning, there was one topic for me that transcends or serves as a bridge between issues of social justice and economics. And that's because of a crisis that we are at least facing in the Virgin Islands, and I believe that in many urban centers, the same crisis is going on, and that relates to the scarcity or the disproportionate number of male students, and especially males of color, who are entering higher education. When I arrived at the University of the Virgin Islands, the population percentage was 75% female, only 25% male. The board was concerned about that, and I certainly was concerned about that, and we've engaged in a number of efforts to try to reverse that, and I will talk about that in a moment. And we are at least now at 29–30% male students. But the reason I see that as a bridge, this challenge as a bridge between those two issues, is that we tend to look at issues such as the underrepresentation of males and males of color as a social issue, and therefore we should be focusing on it from a standpoint of sociology, social work, and all sorts of male empowerment types of perspectives in order to address that problem. But for a small island nation, this problem has economic impacts, and especially small island nations that are dependent upon tourism, because when males, and particularly males of color, choose not to go to higher education, unfortunately, many of them end up in less desirable activities, crime, violence, gangs, that all have an impact not only on the social fabric of the territory, but it has an economic impact, because one detrimental incident in the tourism economy means that tourists begin to feel that a place is not safe and they don't want to come. And so we have committed ourselves to trying to address this social issue and also this economic issue. And just a couple of initiatives that I throw out that we have tried to address. We noticed that around 5th and 7th grade, there is a high percentage of male students who start to drop out. And they become very vulnerable at that age to engaging in other activities, joining gangs, etc. And so we felt we needed to do something that began to keep more of those students on the higher education track. And so one of the projects is a project called Junior University. And this came about not so much by the university, but we were approached by the public school system to do an experiment with them. They had a group of 50 male students who had all failed the 7th grade, who normally they would be held back and would have to repeat that grade, which from the superintendent's perspective meant that most of them would probably drop out or would maybe stay in the educational system but not really perform. So we developed, jointly with them, an intensive summer program, a 4-week summer program that worked on increasing their math and their reading skills, but also trying to expose them to the benefits of a college life and college education. And a large number of those students was able to improve their academic performance so that they could move on to 8th grade and stay in the system. And we experimented with that last summer, and now both school districts are going to impose or develop the same program. Another project that we've done is a Man Up conference that we hold every year, where we invite all junior high and senior high school male students to come to the university for an entire year. For an entire day, to try to expose them to the benefits of higher education, to try to inspire them to stay on the educational path. And though it's only a one-day experience, we're trying to develop some models that will allow us to build on that annual conference so that we are engaging male students on an ongoing basis. And so in the last couple of years, we have begun to see some increases. It's clearly not at the level that we would like, and in no way do I think the problem has gone away. But I raise that as an example to say, as we grapple with these broad global issues and where higher education is headed in the future, each of us, I imagine, have some very local and specific issues that are tearing apart the fabric of the societies in which we exist. And if we ignore those issues as we talk about higher education trends into the future, then we will become irrelevant, because I think the populations we serve are certainly wanting us to address those cutting edge technology issues, but they're also wanting us to play a role in addressing those basic types of issues that threaten the civility of the societies we live in, and I would argue threaten the future economic development of those societies. So bridging the gap between those social change issues and those economic issues is something that I think universities will have to focus on more and more in the future.
I'm glad you raised that issue, President Hall, because that's certainly one of the issues that has been trending at the University of Guam, and I'm sure many other U.S. universities, is this disproportionality between male and female and how you deal with it. Our institutional researcher, the student that's most likely to succeed at the University of Guam is a Filipina. The student that's most likely to fail is a Chamorro male. And so they drop out at higher rates, they have lack of success, and the student that's most likely to succeed is Filipinos, or Filipino males are a little bit less than the Filipino females, but the Filipinas are most likely to succeed. So, you know, it's a very thorny problem because it makes it seem like, well, what do you want to do? Are you trying to hold back success, or what? Are you trying to restrain, or are you trying to unnecessarily promote people? But it's one of those issues that if you simply can't ignore, because it's it doesn't automatically suggest a specific solution either. Except that I did call in a bunch of Chamorro male professors one time and ask them, okay, so what do you guys want to do about this, if anything, you know? And they're all scratching their head, still trying to figure it out, because ostensibly you have Chamorro male role models that are successful because they're teaching at the University of Guam, but it's not clear how that translates into that. So I came up with the alternative idea, is that to try to find a mixed martial art fighter who's a student at the University of Guam. And we did find one, so don't be prepared for some ads.
Some almost 10 years ago, the City University, in recognition of the absence of males in higher education, formed a task force that recommended the establishment of an initiative called the Black Male Initiative. We very quickly, one of the conservative think tanks filed a complaint against the university because it felt that that was exclusive and it would deny access to those services to other students. So, and also in recognition of the fact that a number of Latino students, Hispanic students, but also other students of color were not participating either in higher education. At Lehman, we have a program, we call it the Urban Male Initiative, and that sort of covers anybody. And in fact, we even have some women that have been allowed to come in there because they also have wanted to participate in a very direct way. But I think, to me, the broader context, we've been talking about higher education and research universities and economic development, but we also need to realize that what provides the flow of students is the K-12 system. And for us, in the Bronx, we have some real challenges, and I think any urban area has challenges. We certainly don't have a monopoly on misery and problems. But by that I mean, you know, I go to conferences and I hear people talking about a pipeline. Wow, there's a pipeline. And a pipeline, I'm trained in languages and linguistics, so when I hear the word pipeline, I think of oil or water, and it flows. If it didn't flow, then it wouldn't be a very good pipeline. And yet, when you consider that for some underrepresented males in higher education, in the K-12 system, before they even get there, half of them don't graduate from higher education. In some cases, even higher percentages of that. What kind of a pipeline do we have? And of the ones that do get to higher education, I mean, I'm using Hispanics, Latinos, 1 out of 10 graduates from college. 1 out of 10 students who begins in first grade ends up with a college degree. So this is not a pipeline, this is a trickle. In other words, I suggested to them that maybe we should change the metaphor. And the image that came up in my mind was, and I'm going now to the northwest of the United States, when you have these salmon who come from the ocean and they go up the river to eventually to spawn, and they run into, you know, a lot of streams coming down,
Bears.
dams, and other objects, so that very few of them eventually get there. To me, that's a more accurate depiction of what challenges we have in terms of the K-12 system. But it's essential that we work with them, because that's where a lot of our students are going to come from. Now, at my institution, and I would say probably at many of these other institutions, most of our new students are not coming directly from high school because they don't meet the standards to get into the university. And we're not a very selective institution. There are more institutions at CUNY that are more selective, and God knows some of the private institutions that are even more selective. But we have been ratcheting up our standards very gradually in recognition of the condition of schools. If we did it too soon, we would get very few students directly from high school. But we do get them from the community colleges. And at one point, there was a very difficult debate because CUNY was allowing, you know, CUNY at one point in the 60s was a very closed system that had very few African American and very few Hispanic students. And it was open up to open admissions. So anybody with a high school degree could get into the City University of New York. That solved the problem of access, but it created a problem because essentially by doing that, the City University gave the public schools the admission card for CUNY. So you had a huge growth in terms of access to the university, but it was a revolving door for most of those students because they were not surviving. Many of them lasted 1 semester or a year. So in terms of equity and social justice, what does that mean? Access to what? And how prepared are you to be able to take advantage of what the university has to offer? In the 1990s, in recognition of the budgets going down, the university made a decision that was very controversial, and it was one of the things that I really struggled with, and that is that the university chose to eliminate remediation in the four-year schools, in the senior colleges, the four-year schools, the ones that offer baccalaureate degrees. And people said, that's going to deprive all of these other students from access to higher education. The answer that the university provided at that point was that these students could start their college at the community college. These institutions were much better at providing remediation that was needed by these students than my faculty. I mean, we were not experts in remediation. We were doing it because in a way we had to do it. And there were very dire predictions, doom, of what was going to happen to Black and Latino students in CUNY. Their numbers were going to go down significantly. Well, their numbers didn't go down significantly in the entire university. It went down in some of the senior colleges, but we now get, at Lehman, probably close to 2/3 of our new students are transfer students. We only get 1/3 of our students into the university directly from high school. And we don't have the resources to provide remediation. But we still have to do a little bit of that. We end up doing that. So we have tutoring centers, we have centers, we call them different things, but it's an assistance for students to learn how to do things that they didn't learn in high school. But the only way, ultimately, I think we have to put pressure on the schools in a gradual way so that we end up getting better prepared students. Now, we can have a whole debate about that, about how to go about that, but not now.
Okay, why why don't we open it up? If anybody has a question or, quick question, and go ahead. We'll start with John, and we'll go to Simon. Sure.
Yeah, my name is John Anderson with Marianas Variety here. I have a question. I mean, the whole discussion is higher education, and yet it seems to me that Dr. Hall just pointed out that there's a need for lower education, and we're not addressing that. And I've often wondered, I mean, when I was a graduate from high school back in South Dakota, I spent a year in Germany attending a Hochschule, a high school, German high school, where I learned a little bit about the German system. And in Germany, they identify youngsters at the age of about 10 to 12, which is the 5th to 7th grade age you're talking about, and they identify them as either being on an higher education track or an apprenticeship and vocational training track. And by the age of 14, those youngsters that are on the vocational training track are apprenticing in jobs, learning skills which they are going to be able to convert into income for the rest of their lives. They are not taught or told that higher education is the be-all and end-all of the education system. They are told that they need to learn something that fits with their skills and their abilities to learn. I'll give you two examples just recently from conversations I had. I had a long conversation with a couple the other night at dinner whose daughter has just graduated from one of the finest law schools in the country and passed the California bar and can't find a job. That almost sounds unnatural, to think that a youngster with a law degree can't find a job. But the fact is we've got all kinds of lawyers, too many, and lots of them who can't find jobs. Meanwhile, my own son, who got out of the Navy after about 10 years where they taught him how to do aircraft mechanics and hydraulics and airplane maintenance, got out of the Navy, went for an interview with a company in Louisiana that manufactures and leases heavy drilling equipment, and was hired on the spot and went to work the next day. And he's been there 6 months and has been promoted twice because he has a skill which they need. And I was driving along listening to public radio one day not too many weeks ago, and they were talking about how there are millions of jobs available in the United States and millions of unemployed who haven't got the skills to fill any of those jobs. That's where we fail, it seems to me, as an educational system. So why not at least consider the German model, where we identify youngsters at the age of 10 or 12 in their formative years and put them either on a vocational track or the relatively few of them on the higher education track? My question.
Okay, Don.
If I could, let me pick up on that. When I was a dean in California, in Los Angeles, I spent a lot of time working with high school principals to develop programs that work with students and helping them master science and math and view that as something that they were going to do as part of their career. So when I got to Hawaii, one of the first things I did was to make some appointments to go see school principals. And I learned a lot about Hawaii because the first one I walked into was very thankful to see me and, wanted to know why I was there. And apparently it wasn't part of the culture in Hawaii for higher education to talk to lower education, which is something that I continue to worry about. But, I mean, in addition to multiple tracks that students might take to lifelong activities and fulfilling undertakings, we have made an assumption as an industry and as a society that education is linear. So even if we use the salmon ladder, we get in at the beginning and we get out at the end, and you go through it one way. What we're looking at in Hawaii is how to view education, at least the higher education part, as a network of activities that students do. You may not enter community college and then transfer to a four-year school and then go to graduate school and become a doctor. You may take some certificate programs at the community college, work for a while, come back, take more things, get credentials in a broad sense that stack over the course of time and over the course of your career. how do we as an institution, an educational institution, work with people who take indirect ways to their careers. And at the moment, we don't serve them at all. Much as males of color in some parts of the country are stopping out of higher education, in Hawaii, Native Hawaiians find the traditional approach to higher education doesn't serve their needs. And the question is, how do we rethink what we do so that, if nothing else, we notice what parts of their needs we're not serving so that we can begin to address it?
You know, I guess my first response would be that I really do think higher education has to work extremely close with primary and secondary education to make sure that students are receiving the skills that they need to be successful. And I am not here to be a critic of the German model because it may work very successfully for them. I would have a problem adopting that as the fundamental approach to education, primarily because, using the example of those young men, I would be very reluctant to make a judgment at that stage that they have to be on one track or another, because in reality, all of those young men would have to be put on the vocational track based on how they were performing at that time. It is possible that if a decision was made about me at that age, I would have been put on a vocational track, because we perform at different stages of our lives at different levels. And sometimes we need an intervention by someone, or we need something that forces us to reach our full potential. And so I think the challenge to the fact that there are individuals who are falling off the higher educational track, to me, is not that they don't have the potential to do it. It's that for whatever reason, the system is not exciting them enough for them to understand the benefits of staying on that track and making the sacrifices that are necessary in order to stay on that track. Some of them don't have the parental support or the family structure or the community structure that allows them to succeed on a path that leads to higher education. And as a society, that does not mean that we are saying that vocational ed is lower than or less than higher education and thus an unworthy profession. I'm not in any way suggesting that. But I think we need an educational model that allows people to make choices at different stages and not to get locked in at a particular time. So we do have some challenges. I'd be the first to admit that, but I don't know if the solution is the German model. I think the solution is a tremendous reformation of our K through 12 system so that it is better preparing students to go in different paths, and us making sure that the opportunities that we are creating match up, or that the avenues that we are creating match up with the opportunities that are out there, which is, I think, the problem you've touched on. That is critical, that there are jobs there, but people aren't prepared with the skills to perform those jobs. And that means that higher education needs to be sensitive to workforce needs, and how do we package those skills in ways other than a 4-year degree or a 6-year degree as it has become for some students. And that flexibility is the challenge for higher education.
Simon, you had a question? Then we'll go to the Council General.
Yeah, I've really appreciated the kind of the change in the focus of the discussion. I mean, I'm the child of a university president, and I've been benefited from some good education, and I appreciate the academic effort. And I'm always taken by something Robert says on a regular basis. He talks about being the honest broker, you know, trying to, when a community has a debate, trying to have the university play a role in, you know, framing the issues, making sure everyone's, you know, debating the issues fairly, properly. I mean, you know, we know in in life, there's many ways to sell ideas, but you need someone that at least tries to recognize that, whoa, Simon, that was a very interesting proposal, but some of those assumptions you may want to rethink about, and vice versa. Because I think what we're finding also that's a big challenge for all of us is society's become so polarized. With all the information that we can have access to, it doesn't take much to be a blogger. Then a blogger can have 1 million people, and he can be saying something, and 1 million people could be buying that. But sometimes you need the honest broker to say, wait a minute, that may not be the right perspective. But I find myself, I love the analogy you talked about when you think of a pipeline, you mentioned oil, water, and then somebody said sewer. And I said, I worry about all 3 of those pipelines every day. I'm involved in the utility business, but I had a different image of it. In the water business, we pump up the water. All the water goes up the pump and down that first 10 feet of pipe. Now, from that 10 foot of pipe to the home or the school or wherever it's going to go, like here in our community, we have tremendous leakage. The school system, 99.99% of us at least start in kindergarten. We get in the pipe. And as we go through the pipe of life, some of us stay close to school, some follow the academic life, some go to college, get degrees, become an academic, become a business person, become what you can be. But we have this huge concern everywhere about people leaving that pipeline once they're in it, where elementary school, middle school, high school, we're not graduating all the kids we wish we could graduate with, whether we send them to a college or some professional technical degree. We have a large universe of people that just don't get the skill sets and the critical thinking that is needed. There's a lot of, everybody has some innate wisdom, or most people have innate wisdom. And the challenge is they can, even someone that's been on welfare for the 3rd generation has figured out how to do it. Smart enough, they're not stupid. They're smart enough how to be that 3rd, 4th generation family that says, I'm going to depend on other people to take care of me. So we know people are smart, but somehow we lose them through leakage along the way of the pipeline. My wife is returning to college to get her degree many years after she could have. So she's come back in, she left the pipeline, she came back in the pipeline. There was a way for her to come back to the university, but there was enough skill sets and innate knowledge in her that she wanted to come back. There was some value to being in the university. So we know we've got capable people that get motivated for all sorts of reasons, but we're struggling to have them come out with enough skill sets to make good decisions where society can move forward and they be more of a contributor and less of a burden. And being in the private sector here in Guam and even involved with our utilities, in the last 10, 15 years, we've hired 10, 15 locally educated Guamanians, educated at public schools or private schools, gone off to college, come back to Guam, and we're hiring them at our utilities. Now we're trying to help Bob get his School of Engineering going because we know we need trained engineers. We need that skill set. But one of the things, having worked with engineers for 10 years, is their critical thinking tends to focus around the numbers and the widget they're designing or whatever it is. And when you start talking about socioeconomic impacts, they kind of just look at you, right? I mean, not that they don't care, it's just not their thing. As academics, as teachers, you get a chance to teach people not only about skill sets, but also about critical thinking so that when we have these issues before us that we're all wrestling with, that the debate and the discussion that can occur comes from well-informed people agreeing to at least certain rules of engagement that, like bald-faced lying should at least be reserved only for like presidential candidates. But that because we were having a great discussion at lunch about how do we get more money into the DOE, the school system, and you've tapped on it. If the university doesn't help the school system train better students, then your pipeline, the leak in the pipeline that's occurring, that is discouraging smart people to go to college, we're not fixing it. And you have a vested interest, an absolute vested interest in helping us fix the pipeline because it's not getting to where it needs to go. And so I don't have any answers. I agree with you. There's no simple solution.
Well, do you have a question?
Well, I guess my question is how are you going to make those trade-offs, and how do we encourage the community to critically think that it's not just some partisan position, it's not just, you know, because the funny thing about all of us, if you ask what the outcomes are, you know, 99 out of 100, they want world peace, they want full employment, they want a great education system and great universities. But we argue and stifle progress by not being able to agree on how to reach that conclusion. And I find that to be the biggest void as I hire people, and now that I'm an old guy now, I used to be a young guy, but having hired enough people, I find the ability to think critically. Whether you're a blue-collar person or, you know, someone on public assistance trying to crawl out, or a PhD, if you're not able to go beyond just what you've been taught and be able to think beyond yourself, that you have a role in society, you can contribute to society. Society has a cost when you struggle and we have to help you. And that you're part of this whole picture. You know, that seems to be what I find to be the biggest missing point, and I don't know what you do about it. That's why I came today to listen.
I think you're really hitting on the exact nature of much of the conversation, because certainly, as Dr. Pascual pointed out, you know, they're reinforcing the 2 years of general ed, and then, you know, other Southeast Asian nations that have just previously focused on, you know, just specific training for specific professions or positions are rethinking that. Critical thinking is part of the equation. It's the whole point is that there is no fixed solution at any point in time. It's constantly it's constantly mobile. So if you say, yes, developmental ed should only be done at the K through 12, well, that won't work. If it only should be done at the community college, that may work for a few years. Maybe it should be done at a 4-year institution. We don't know. If we can figure out what a person is capable of at the age of 10, maybe we can figure it out when they're 7. Maybe we can figure it out when they're 5. But somehow I think that would be kind of less than satisfying. One of I had this argument years ago. I always thought of myself as kind of in opposition to everything that was occurring as part of the U.S., until I went to, I did a farm tour in Australia, and I had the misfortune of staying with someone who was, they were professors from the Soviet Union, and they were arguing about the American university system, and I found myself defending them, and it was the first time in my life I said, well, you know, the thing about America is they never close the door on opportunity. That's the thing. That's you know, it's kind of messy sometimes. But you know, when you figure out that the average age of a community college student is 31, and the average age of a University of Guam student used to be 26, now they're younger, and it's around 24, this means that there's a lot of mobility going on. And to some extent, it's a waste of resources, but on the other hand, and there's things that need fixing in it. There's who's participating, who's not participating. These may call for long-term solutions, short-term solutions, but they certainly call for a lot of conversation, as you've pointed out, Simon, and they call for evidence-based conversation. It's not just sharing opinions. You know, there's some evidence here. Yes. Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, let me just share a couple of things that we have come up with in terms of specific solutions to specific situations. Well, rest assured that the problem with gender mix is not just in your particular schools. You know, in my university, the new freshman catch, you know, is 65% female. You know. One solution, of course,
so Filipinos are doing better there too, huh?
Better than the male.
Well, in our College of Medicine, for example, the only, you know, sure solution was to have an affirmative action, you know. So in the admission, has to be half should be men, half should be women, you know. Because otherwise, the class would be predominantly women, you know. And poor male patients like me, I will have to consult with a woman for some problems. I should be consulting with a male doctor. Anyway, so that's one very specific solution. Now, we found out also that in our rural areas, we cannot get our graduates to serve, you know, as health workers. So we came up with this notion of schools of health sciences in remote areas where we have instituted a ladderized program. So we admit high school graduates initially to graduate after 2 years with a health worker certificate, then a midwife, and then eventually bachelor's degree in nursing, and then he goes back, serves the community, and then come back and eventually end up with a Doctor of Medicine degree. And our experience so far has been very good because the graduates of Doctor of Medicine degrees from these rural schools, have been achieving 100% passing rate in the national medical examination. So it addresses a specific problem with a very specific solution. I think that's essentially what President Underwood is saying. There is no one size fits all solution.
Very good. We'll ask the last question here. We'll save it for the Council General. Okay.
Actually, I would like to add the comments made by Dr. Hall about linking up preparations from the secondary to post-secondary or tertiary education. And also, it has something to do with the German model by Mr. Anderson. And of course, Mr. Sanchez fixing up the pipeline. I will start with Mr. Sanchez. Why do we have to wait for the pipeline to be fixed up? I think the most important thing is to preempt fixing up pipeline. And I think one of the reasons why we are encountering such kind of a problem is because of a basic issue. We have forgotten about proper guidance and counseling. In the lingo of the University of Guam, it's called improving student academic advisement. And also appropriate curriculum design that will be responsive to the needs of the world economy and the dictates of technology. So basically, it goes back to guidance and counseling. Back home, in the University of the Philippines where I came from, there were so many students there whom we call professional students. Professional in the sense that they have stayed in the university for 11 years instead of finishing 4-year course. Or we call them the overstaying students. Why? These are the students who were not properly guided. And so my question now is, how are we going to improve this using the lingo of the University of Guam, improving student academic advisement in such a way as we don't have to fix up any pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any comments, parting comments? Well, I want to thank the panel again. I want to thank all of you for staying with us.